Center for Negotiation and Dispute Resolution at UC Hastings College of the Law. I want to welcome you on behalf of my staff, Maddie Robertson, our Deputy Director, and Hind Al-Jarbara, who may be joining us later. She has been without power since yesterday, so no Zooming for her. We are recording this, so we want you to know that. If anyone has problems with that, please put something in the chat. This is the third session in a series we've been putting on this academic year. The first two sessions were with Grand Lum, who spoke about civil rights and ADR and his book on that subject, and John Landy, who wrote a book on risk assessment in litigation. So we're delighted to have this third session be on one of my favorite subjects, about which I hope to learn from David and Susan, restorative justice. Susan is a trainer in the restorative justice programs for the San Francisco District Attorney's Neighborhood Courts program. She's also conducted victim offender conferencing and case management for the San Mateo Juvenile Probation Department and community dispute mediations for the Peninsula Conflict Resolution Center, the Department of Police Accountability, and she's led victim offender workshops at San Quentin State Prison and San Mateo's McGuire Women's Correctional Facilities. So we're really lucky to have her with us today. From 1980 to 2005, Susan worked as a broadcaster, programmer, and union steward in public radio, communications environment rich in diverse and often dissenting parties. And I'm very pleased to have David Cherniss, former San Mateo Senior Managing Attorney for the ADR and Legal Support Services Division of the Superior Court. He transitioned from private practice, where he was for 20 years, transitioned in 2001 to come to the court and to develop the victim offender restorative justice mediation programs for the juvenile division of San Mateo Superior Court. In 2005, he assumed management oversight for both the delinquency and dependency juvenile mediation programs and continued to leverage and expand the services through innovative and collaborative community and agency partnerships. Most importantly, he trained and worked with dedicated community volunteers, a few of whom are here today. So welcome to you all. The two programs he ran received recognition as models within the state and served as an example for visiting dignitaries and judicial officers from several countries around the world. The programs have continued to evolve, adapt, and successfully serve the court and community of San Mateo throughout the past 20 years. So with that, I turn it over to Susan and David.
Thank you very much, and welcome everybody who's on the call. So I guess the first question is, why restorative justice? And for me, I think restorative justice has been kind of an evolutionary path forward in addressing juvenile crime, while at the same time connecting us back to the original construct for juvenile justice. About 100 years or so ago, a separate juvenile justice system was created with the goal of diverting youth offenders from criminal courts and a penal system of punishment and retribution to a system that encourages rehabilitation. In fact, for those who don't know, the juvenile justice system is rooted in the civil code as opposed to the penal code. In the late 70s and 80s, the number of serious juvenile crimes were growing, youth prisons were expanding, and recidivism was rising. The juvenile justice system was again heading down a path of punishment and retribution, and we were essentially criminalizing adolescents. So restorative justice really began in the US by its development in the early 80s through pioneers like Howard Zehr, Mark Umbright, and Ron Clausen. Howard Zehr wrote a book which you might be familiar with called Changing Lenses. And that kind of defined what restorative justice was. It suggested that the application of its principles and its values as a contrasting response to juvenile crime, to look at it, really look at our response through a different lens. Instead of punishment and retribution, he suggested that justice should be healing and versatile. And that's when programs throughout the US started to develop and pop up. And you can think of restorative justice as kind of a framework, the roots and principles of which were derived from actually indigenous cultural practices, the Aboriginals, First Nation, and of their community's response to wrongdoing, which was really driven by the belief that involvement of all of the impacted parties would help preserve the relationships within the community, while at the same time ensuring that the persons who caused the wrongdoing took responsibility for making it right for those who were impacted or harmed. So think of the framework of restorative justice, or the basis of it, as a relational understanding of wrongdoing, problems or harms that puts a premium on dialogue. The primary principles are when there is harm, whether it's to people, to property, to relationships, or community, that there's an obligation for repairing that harm, and that there is engagement. And engagement, I mean, by those who were impacted by the harm. So those three principles are really are subject to the values that we instill in the processes of respect for all parties, whether it's the victim we're dealing with, whether it's the offenders, or whether or not it's someone in the community. But it's respect for all of those that are party to this, for taking responsibility, and for developing a plan for repairing and restoring those relationships. Early examples of the processes that came out of those early studies and such were things like victim offender mediation, talking circles, group conferencing, to name a few. So in early 2001, I'm going to do a shout out here to Sheila, because it was her vision really that brought funding and the ability to have a staff person at the court to begin developing a restorative justice program within the juvenile court. And also people like Susan, I know Roy's on the call as well, who are really our star volunteers, volunteer mediators, our outreach ambassadors, and us actually our volunteer mediator trainers over time. And those stars are the folks that really made our program successful. And it's been successful for now 20 years. And so I'm really proud of the fact that the basis of that and the strength of our volunteers is what really keep the program going. So the San Mateo program was somewhat unique in that it was one of the first in the state that was actually developed and administered as a superior court program, with that funding that Sheila was able to get for a staff position. I think probably the most significant aspect of starting to design and develop a program such as the one we had, was really the creation of an effective advisory committee. An advisory committee can provide you with support, system integration, buy-in, sustainability, and what I call juice. And juice is really those leaders and such that can bring folks to the table and really support the program as you're developing. These are leaders and community stakeholders. And in our case, it's the ones that are related to youth and the existing juvenile justice system. Within a community or within like our county, there are lots of different systems, and you need to bring all of those systems to the table in order to have a successful program. And it's really important to bring the right people to the table. So I'm going to say first that you really need someone who is strongly supportive of the program and has the juice to get the other people to the table. In our case, that person was our Superior Court juvenile judge. And when you have someone like a judge or someone who has that kind of ability to bring the folks to the table, that's going to get the other leaders of the other community organizations and stuff to the table so that you can have the conversations that are necessary to develop a successful program. In our case, our advisory committee included our juvenile court judges, both of them, the chief of probation and their deputies, law enforcement. We had 5 police chiefs out of the 21 that were in the community. We had the sheriff, we had the district attorney, a private defender, we had victim advocates, we had folks from mental health, folks from alcohol and drug. We had the superintendent of schools for education. We had our community mediation partners, and we had other community youth service providers. So we asked ourselves initially, who are the people that have a role with the youth that we'll be dealing with so that we can bring them to the table? And I would have to say that, there are some folks who think having this many people at the table make things more difficult. But the reality is, without them, is you're not able to build a successful program, because they are a significant resource in developing what your mission statement is going to be, what your policies are going to be, what your protocols are going to be, procedures, what your goals and what your accountability are. And they're great sounding boards. And although they may not agree with everything that you would like to do as far as the direction of the program, having them there, it gives you the ability to flesh out any resistance issues that you might have. And it's better to come out at the table so that you have a collaborative forum, which allows you to address whatever those issues are in a controlled environment, as opposed to it coming at you from all of these agencies from the outside later while you're trying to get your program off and running. But it also allows you to move forward with collective buy-in when you start to begin your program. And later, those same people who may have had some resistance to certain things become your ambassadors within their respective organizations, as well as the community at large. So I would have to say that probably without that type of basis to begin, you really can't build as strong or as sustainable of a program. And so I think they were invaluable. Some of the issues that we dealt with in the very beginning had to do with, is our program going to be a replacement? Is it going to be an alternative, or is it going to be integrated within the same pathways of the youth that were coming in? We had to talk about what are our referral sources going to be? Is it only going to be the judge sending youth to us? Is it going to be direct referrals from probation or direct referrals from education for things that are going on within the schools? And we opted to open our referral sources to all of those areas, because the idea was that we would be the gatekeepers as opposed to others out in the community being the gatekeepers. We wanted to open our doors to anyone that had the issues that we were going to be dealing with, and then we could determine whether or not the people that were referred were actually amenable to the mediation process that we were setting up. We looked at types of crime. In the early 80s, there was a lot of, and there still may be a lot of resistance to the types of crimes that were going to be referred to a mediation process, because folks thought that mediation was soft on crime, or that the process of restorative justice was soft on crime. But the truth is the folks that came through the program really dealt with their own accountability in a very different way. And it had a huge impact, I think, on recidivism, which was, I'll talk about it a little bit later as we move through the issues. But we opted to, I think there was only one crime that there was resistance to, and that was some of the sexual assaults. And later on, as we gained more and more credibility with what we were able to do through mediation, even some of those sexual assaults were referred to us, but only after the parties that were involved had gone through counseling and dealt with mental health issues and the other things that are involved before folks are ready to discuss those in this types of setting. We talked about who the participants were. For our mediations, we wanted to make sure we had the person or persons who were charged with causing the harm. We wanted to have the actual person or representative of the person or entity be participating as on the victimized side. And we utilize volunteers primarily as our mediators. So we had the community involvement as well, as opposed to having everything done by staff. We also had a training component and required significant training for those that were going to participate as our mediators and our case developers. Mediation in restorative justice sense is a little bit different than community mediation, in the sense that community mediation is primarily looking at equal parties in some sort of a dispute, whereas in victim offender mediation, we have someone who is actually victimized. So we needed to be extremely sensitive to what their needs were in setting the playing table. And although parties had equal say in the discussions, we still had to remember that they're not disputants here. There's actually someone who was victimized and somebody who caused some harm. And that way, they can take responsibility for the harm they caused. Now, there were oftentimes cases where it wasn't quite so clear as to who was actually the party who caused the harm, because there were mutual fights and things like that. And those are certainly a little more equal in the process. But being victim sensitive is extremely important in developing a program like this. Another thing that we dealt with is this process going to be voluntary or is it going to be mandatory? And it was very important to us, like in other mediations, that the parties come to the table on a voluntary basis. You don't want to force someone into a situation like this, especially if they've been victimized, but also if they were the person who caused the harm, because you set up a real possibility that you can cause additional harm if the person's coming to the table and doesn't want to be there. So that was something that we charged with our case developers, which were also generally our mediators, to assess whether or not a case was appropriate to go forward and meet in mediation. And sometimes we found that people really weren't ready at that time. So timing can also be an issue. So it's really important in your training programs that your volunteers and your mediators and such have that type of awareness to really be able to assess out what's going to be appropriate and what's not. Another thing that had to be dealt with are things like locations and safety. Oftentimes we were dealing with folks that were in rival gangs or didn't feel safe in a certain area. And because we were utilizing community-based areas to have our mediations, we needed to know that not only would the parties be safe in coming to those areas, but also the mediators would be safe in holding their meetings there. And so we had our mediations everywhere within the county of San Mateo, which allows access, but it also allows a certain amount of comfort for perhaps somebody who's victimized and they can do something in their neighborhood and have this meeting there. Another big issue, and probably is an ongoing issue continually, is confidentiality and reporting. Mediation in California for juvenile cases is completely confidential. And when you're dealing with all of your partner agencies, such as probation, mental health, and alcohol and drug, everybody has their own confidentiality issues and their own regulations that they're following. So it's very challenging to negotiate those types of issues so that you can get the things done that are necessary to get done, especially with mediation, which is confidential. So our ability to do that was that we would report back that a mediation took place, but nothing about what the outcome was unless the parties agreed to that. And oftentimes it's to their benefit to agree to have that information disclosed, especially if they want the judge to adopt whatever it is that their agreement is. And we actually had judges that would change their rulings based upon the agreements that came out of mediation. Lastly is follow-up. You need to be able to have a system set up on how you can follow up with the parties to see that the agreements that they come up with are successful and meaningful, and to see that everything is working in accordance to what their needs were when they came up with the agreement. And the last part in that is accountability. How do you know that what you're doing is working or is being successful? So we measured that in a couple of ways. One was we had a system of follow-up that would allow people to fill out a form talking about what they thought of the process, whether it met their needs, what they thought of the mediation process in and of itself, and whether or not they were satisfied. So it was essentially a satisfaction survey. The other thing was looking at recidivism. As I said earlier, recidivism was a huge problem and a growing problem in juvenile justice. And at the time when we started our program, in our particular juvenile court, we had a recidivism rate of almost 60, 70%. And what that means is that folks who committed crimes after they went through the system were coming back and committing crimes again. When we did our studies several times over the maybe 10 years or so, we looked at whether or not youth had committed other crimes and whether or not if they did commit crimes, whether they were more serious or not when they did commit a crime, or whether they had a violation of probation. And what we found was that the folks who went through the process of mediation, our recidivism rates were lowered to less than 10%, and actually some were as low as 4%. So we did see a significant change in their behaviors, but remembering that in many cases, mediation was not the only intervention that the youth were dealing with. Sometimes they had alcohol and drug issues that they were dealing with. So there were other things. Plus, because they were doing this as a voluntary program, they were also somewhat self-selective in doing this. But the amount of recidivism and the reduction was significant within our county. The last thing I'm going to talk about briefly, where am I on time? I lost my, am I taking into your time yet, Susan? For sustainability, there's obviously funding and resource needs. Because our program was basically just funding 1 or 2 staff people within the court, we didn't have a lot of the same issues that like community-based organizations might have with funding. But what kept our program alive was the fact that we utilize volunteers, and our volunteers are what kept us going. And I think volunteers are an incredible resource for maintaining sustainability of a program. The other is outreach. People change within the different systems you're dealing with. People change within the community. Situations change. And the best way to maintain the success of a program is having a good outreach program and utilizing your mediators and your other volunteers as ambassadors for the program. People tend to forget that you even exist. And so it's really important to be out there letting folks know that you're available and that you're addressing the needs and the issues that they have within the community. I think another incredibly important piece to sustainability is systemic integration. We became essentially one of the arms of assistance for probation. Our probation department had developed a program where every youth that came into the system went through probation initially first, and had an assessment as to what their needs and such were. Because of our credibility, oftentimes we had referrals from probation directly to us as an alternative to having the youth even go through the regular court system. And they had us listed as almost an integral part of the probation department. The other thing we did was we developed early on, we found that we had youth that weren't quite ready to mediate just because they didn't have a real understanding of what the impact of their behavior was on victims. And so we were able to get a grant to start what was called a victim impact awareness class, which we partnered with probation and a couple of our community-based organizations, which basically required that youth go to this class to learn what the impact is of different crimes and victimization. And as a requirement of graduating out of that class, they had to contact us for mediation. So we had a natural resource for referral that help sustain the program as well. And the last thing is just your accountability. If you can show that you're effective and you have a means to show your partners that you're effective, then that's going to assist in your sustainability as well.
Wonderful. Thank you, David. There's so much there to ask questions about, but we'll hold off on that for now and turn to Susan. Susan, take it away.
I'll pick up. Thank you so much, David. What I want to address is just where we are now in terms of the national sort of social fabric and how things are changing dramatically. And I will also include
Susan, somehow you got muted. Can you?
Yeah.
Okay, now you're good. Keep going. Let's see if
sorry, I don't know. I saw I got muted by host. So with the dramatically changing pace and patterns of youth crime nationally, groundwork has been laid recently to look at alternatives to juvenile hall detention, to reform housing, and to youth incarceration itself. So to figure out what life for the youth and addressing his or her offenses would look like in a post-juvenile hall world, we're going to look at first what's been going on. There's been a two-decade decline in youth crime across the nation, which has led the entire system to consider how these reduced arrest and detention numbers could lead to alternative thinking about how community-based solutions for lower level offenses can be addressed while leaving the more serious cases in the courtroom, such as rape and homicide and arson. I have a breakdown, which may not have enough time for that, to talk about what has impacted crime the most in terms of its decline. But if there's time at the end, I will go there. It's fascinating. From 1999 to 2018, there was a 76% decline in referrals of youth to the system, from police arrests, school suspensions, family or community disturbances, which would often end up with families literally leaving at the door of juvenile hall a youth that they couldn't handle. 50% of that overall decline occurred in just the last 7 years. So this huge decline in detention led to, at San Francisco Juvenile Hall, for example, a reduction of a daily population that had been sort of steady at 119 to about 45 young people. And many of them were there with mental health issues, so not outright crime. It is essential to note, however, that as the overall numbers have declined, racial and ethnic disparities in the juvenile justice system have become even more extreme. So to help address these issues of disparity, along with restorative justice alternatives and re-entry, which is our major goal, get them back to school, get them back into their homes and their community, if that's a healthy alternative. A number of years ago, the San Francisco District Attorney's Office partnered with a community stakeholder program through a youth court to launch something called the Make It Right program. It's a restorative justice approach for ages 13 through 17, and more recently extended to 25 years of age for those youth facing prosecution for an array of felony charges in San Francisco. The other partner in this program is my office, the Neighborhood Courts program, which addresses nonviolent felonies and misdemeanors. We're part of a collaborative court system under the San Francisco Superior Court, and it's a very, very interesting alliance that I find productive and I would say ever evolving, just because they're really keeping a pulse on where things are at in the city. The stakeholders who support these court programs are wraparound agencies and residencies specializing in victim offender mediation, trauma counseling, substance abuse counseling, community service, and engagement in areas where the youth lives, job and skills building, vocational training, outdoor exercise, and meditation. And I have to just say on a personal note, I cannot get over how many times these children that I see in San Francisco have never seen the ocean. And sometimes, just a nature trip can almost change their perspective on how big the world is and how much bigger it is than what's been impacting their lives. Most crucially, cognitive behavioral therapies, CBT therapies have really started to help youth diffuse and address and reset those adolescent neural pathways that so often impact their psychological and social development. But I want to take a step back for just a moment, because what happens to these kids before they even show up in our courts? Why are they coming here? And studies have shown over the years that when youth fall off the school radar, they show up in other places like the welfare, foster care, or judicial system. And many of them enter the system because of disruptive behavior, not outright crime or misdemeanors. For many, the first time they encounter structure, routine, rules, or consequences outside of a troubled home or outside of school, especially if they're chronically truant or expelled, has been in detention at juvenile hall. And there they have found structure, obligation, consequences, as well as when they're on probation or while they are in diversionary programs assigned to them as a result of their behaviors. But that's not ideal. It's just not ideal. And that's why all of this is being looked at. In addition to the decline in crime, what we're looking at now are additional stressors brought on by coronavirus impacts. Young folks, as well as, if not more than us as adults, are struggling to gain control of the uncontrollable. Their schedules have been upended, their plans are canceled, their school years and their job futures are on hold. All this uncertainty has been breeding profound anxiety. Many might discount or bury what they have been experiencing because they believe others have it worse. Coupled with that, the stigma of needing mental health counseling and not getting it, or not knowing where to turn, not having somebody's eyes on you, nobody's seeing their coaches or their teachers anymore. A lot of youth are not seeking help at all. On a personal note, despite what has been, again, a growing decline in youth crime, it's really unknown how the impacts of COVID, be it desperation, unemployment, idleness, no structured in-school classes, mental health, will lead to bad and dangerous decision-making and opportunistic offenses going forward. So that is to be revealed. What we can discover now in our case development and questioning is, what are their current offenses due to? Is it revenge or boredom? Is it a dare? Feeling shamed? Is it a gang initiation, a mistake? Is it feeling powerless, being misunderstood? Again, might we sense a mental health issue at play? Is it PTSD from witnessing a shooting or the death of a loved one? Is it bullying, family poverty, fear? Is there drug or alcohol influence, chronic truancy, especially now with distance learning challenges? And a lot of times it's social media distress, which is disrupting or derailing their lives. So we're looking at all of those things with a very deep investigative inquiry, if you will, at the point of case intake and certainly during our mediations. In cases where offending youth are first generation Americans or recent arrivals to this country, there are other unique stressors. Family language differences leading to family chaos and conflict, parents calling the police on a child they no longer understand, children separating out from relatives with whom they no longer identify or want to share the language, and resenting or rejecting the family values, distancing themselves by taking on new mannerisms and attitudes. The thing too that is continually challenging is that the youth of today are digital natives. We are seeing children born after 2000 at this point. They've grown up in social media saturated worlds, and they often have the added stress of maintaining two personalities: a digital profile, which can be airbrushed or backdropped with contrived context, sometimes hyped up, fictional, or they're experiencing painful exclusion, missing out on the group fun as they perceive it. So their real life is one thing they have to manage, where there's truth and challenges of a daily existence. It can't be ignored. And the other life that they're trying to strive to be online. So they're living two lives. They're managing two selves. They're juggling anonymity, overexposure, experiencing the aftershock of hitting send by mistake. I think we've all been there. And since, again, these year-long COVID impacts, I think a public health issue is what is now really arising for many of us looking at the children we currently have been seeing, kids disappearing off the school radar altogether. So we're looking at all of those things, which is why as we contemplate a post-juvenile hall life, we have to be very expansive in our thinking, consider all the reasons for their offenses, what is the context of their offenses, what are the crucial conversations we need to have with you, as opposed to saying what's wrong with you, finding new language, what's been going on for you, what led up to this, what role have you played, even if you feel you have no part in this, and trying to determine what still glitters within, what is still what light is still shining? How can we find them separate from the police report that defines them? There's that saying, sticks and stones may break my bones, but words can never hurt me. I think that Roy Gordon on this phone call, on this Zoom today, and David Cherniss, certainly with whom I've worked, both of you, will know that children often live down to the things they're labeled by. They live down to the expectations that have been lowered and the expectations of that child. So we try to find what it is that still literally glitters within, and try to move through the blind spots in the way we process information about that person, so we don't just chalk it up to a bad neighborhood, a broken home, or a spotty school attendance record. So we dig as deeply as we can. We reflect back, especially using the phrases they use, to find out what it is they're circling to get to the core piece. We never try to lose track of the victim voice, whether we read a victim impact statement into the police record or we have the victim present. We want to make sure we pay attention to who's been harmed here. Many times the offender has been harmed long before he or she has acted out, sometimes against a family member that they finally had to strike out against, setting up a series of patterns of behavior. So we don't want to be hard-lined in our categorical thinking that there's a victim and an offender. We look at what we call the harmed parties and the harming behavior, so that we can see exactly what the best possible outcome is. Zoom has been difficult. Internet access is tricky for many of the children we now see because of COVID. Confidentiality is next to impossible. They're living in shared spaces. They often have to have someone listening in, so they can't talk to us in real time about what's been happening. In prior life, many of our community partners provided community rooms, public libraries, police department gathering spaces, YMCAs, church basements for our meetings, and we have lost that at present. So we're trying to return to what we once knew as normal eventually, with a 3D world, so we can really read the body language, study the child, and figure out what is going on in the overall surround of this child's experience. So in the interest of time, what I will say at this point is, here's to returning to what we once knew as a normal context in which we deeply invest and inquire into these children's lives with an eye and an ear on how this country's social fabric has been stretched so thin and really torn in these times. There are likely many new and different impacts on the youth we're going to see, and we will need structures and remedies to help meet their needs and help them age in a healthy and safe way for the sake of us all.
Fantastic. Thank you, Susan.
You're welcome.
The youth are lucky to have the two of you and all the other volunteers like Roy. You clearly care, and they clearly need the help. So we're going to open it up now to questions, and I will try and see you put your hands up either in with the little hand icon, or visually just turn on your camera for a second if you have a question, and I will call on you if I see you. And while we're waiting for you all to think of a few, I'd be curious to know, David and Susan, how restorative justice practices might inform other kinds of mediation practices, such as family law or civil mediation. I know that it's quite distinct, but do you think there are ways in which restorative justice practices might be applied even in other settings that are more mainstream, more equal-sided parties?
Go for it, David.
I guess from my own perspective, and this circles back to when I used to practice, and it seemed like a lot of the mediations that were being held in the civil realm I think there was more facilitation in the process than what is normally utilized in restorative justice types of mediations, where the dialogue between the parties is crucial and is probably the most important. Mm-hmm. And I found oftentimes that without that dialogue, there's a lot that gets missed that could probably assist in resolving issues.
Mhm.
And I would say, especially in family law realm, what a lot of folks don't recognize is that in many cases, especially if there's children involved, there's a long-lasting relationship. It may be a bad relationship, but I think restorative practices could help make it a better relationship.
Mhm.
And in that context, I could see the application being really helpful in recognizing that the people that are coming to the table have had a relationship of one sort or another,
Mhm.
and whether or not they're going to continue that relationship, at least coming through a restorative justice type of mediation process, I think it's a little more civil.
Yeah.
And probably longer lasting if parties have the type of respect that they have in a restorative justice type of process. I think even the agreements they come out with are longer lasting.
Interesting. Yeah, maybe a deeper dive into the underlying relationships
Mhm.
kind of allows for more creative solutions. So questions from others? Roy, maybe? I see you looking at the camera. You want to, if not a question, you could comment on being a mediator in one of these programs. So if you choose to unmute, you're welcome to speak.
Sure. So the 6 or 8 years that I spent in that program was just some of the most rewarding and fascinating mediation I've ever done in 30 years of mediation. That's really been the high point.
Mm-hmm.
And mostly thanks to David and Susan and some of the other wonderful people we had there. So I guess that, Susan, you were very eloquent in talking about the challenges that COVID's brought to the program and everything. So what is, do you have any sense of what's going on in other places? Like, we took your program and copied it exactly into Santa Clara. And as far as I know, that program is still going really well. And do you have any sense of what's going on in the rest of California or the rest of the country?
This particular program, Neighborhood Courts, that is bringing seasoned volunteers as adjudicators to talk to young people, and actually all ages at this point, has rolled this same program out in LA County and Yolo County, and I think a few other counties, Modoc, and they're dealing with a lot of repeat offending behavior situations. And so they realize that the traditional, judicial systems haven't worked. So what does it look like when these people meet the harmed parties? What are the outcomes? And we are seeing measurable recidivism as a result. Once these people, young people especially, are not just locked away, but have to do community engagement, whether it's working on restitution for the stolen car, the lost jewelry, or whether it has to do with, honoring a restraining order, but in trying to make amends in some other way by, seeking and completing substance abuse programs with measurable accountability there. We're just finding that once they see they have an opportunity to re-enter life, they have a greater goal and incentive to do so.
Great. Great. I know we have folks here from Maryland. Kathy, I don't know if you've got a program you wanted to share anything about. We have folks here from Santa Cruz.
There is one question in the chat here.
Okay, could you read it to us, Maddie?
Bruce, have you written any articles about the considerations in establishing a restorative justice system or program?
David?
Been
far more literary, I think.
No, I haven't written any articles per se. The state bar had an article a while ago with regards to our program, but I've not written anything specific other than that.
I wrote an article on all the programs in San Mateo, including the juvenile victim offender programs, that when we follow up with an evaluation, I'll try and dig it up and attach it. It's about building 8 different mediation programs, including the juvenile justice program. And there are some threads that run through all of them, but certainly restorative justice is its own unique set of considerations. And I imagine there are people who've written on this, but I am not one of them either. Maybe there are others in attendance who have something they want to recommend. or that they're aware of.
Thank you.
This is sort of a sidebar, but I just want to throw it out there. I think there's been a lot that we've learned lately, we being those who are looking at evolving models of restorative justice for especially repeat behaving youth. And it's the reentry program at San Quentin. And it's almost a paradox that, here you have this institution that has good and bad reputation for so many reasons, but its reentry programs have been exceptional. Podcasts have been made of it. You've probably heard there are just some amazing men who've been talking about what it means to have job and vocational skills to get back into life and to catch up with the 21st century. I mean, having never had a cell phone, having never, been able to really adapt to social media, never having known about it. And watching what they are doing to get their lives back has been a way of reframing how we keep our youth on track and how we keep them in the community as well. And a lot of these men are starting to become mentors. And I'm very excited about that because I think there's a lot of wisdom to be handed down from people who've been sidelined for so long, but who are looking at young people and helping them not become sidelined for the rest of their lives.
Yeah, and the mutual reciprocity that might occur could be fantastic. So that's a wonderful idea. What about your hopes for the future with restorative justice, either of you, David or Susan? I think you've touched on some of that, but it sounds like it's being implemented in more and more jurisdictions. I'm sure the challenges around funding remain if it's anything like when I was back at the court, but it has proven itself as practical on top of being fantastic for the families and kids.
I think Roy and David have probably heard me say this before. If we could wave a magic wand, rather than needing to continue to fortify our juvenile justice and our adult justice courts, it would be to address truancy in all of its forms. What is happening when that child falls off the radar? Long before that child becomes a teen or an adult, what does the family need? Who's homeless? Who's without a job? Who's got economic straits? If we could address truancy, I think we could make a world of difference. It would have to be done in a way that nurtures the entire family, the home scene, as opposed to singling out the child and putting it in the shame-blame category of failure. But I have often believed that if you lose track of that child early on, that child is going to be waylaid the rest of his or her life by other situations that will probably cause it, not unlike broken window theory, to just go, why bother? I'm giving up. Nobody cares. Nobody notices.
Yeah.
So I would just put my money there.
Yeah, and David, you ran a program that in part addressed truancy, apart from the delinquency and dependency programs. I'm forgetting the name of it. It had a cute acronym. Do you remember what I'm talking about? In the schools?
It was actually an alternative to expulsion type of program.
Oh, right.
With the schools. But I would agree with Susan. I think one of the stark realities for me when I first started with the program is my experience with juvenile crime and youth was always negative. And I think it's the same with most people when they see things in the news or read about them and see what youth are up to and some of the crimes. But I think my realization was when you start talking to these kids, regardless of what they've done, most of them are still just kids. And I think we forget that. And I think that's probably what's most important is whether it's truancy or anything else, is remembering who they are, where they're getting their guidance and their support is incredibly important. And I think, like Susan said, if we started focusing on those types of things, even with restorative practices within the families or within the schools, I think we would probably eliminate a lot of those following issues where they end up committing a crime. And that goes along too with the fact that, when I said we were criminalizing adolescents, I spoke to so many youth that had done something that when you listen to it and you see what they were actually charged with, for instance, I remember one of the first cases we had were 4 youth who had gone onto a golf course and were driving the golf carts all over the place. And they were charged with grand theft auto. And when you look at that, these are kids being kids. And granted, it was wrong for them to do it. And we resolved it through a restorative practice. But I think if we started with that type of lens, I think we would probably address a lot of the issues in a much more supportive and successful way.
Yeah. I want to once again invite questions from the audience, and also to ask if any of the programs represented here by all the folks who I'm reading about in the chat, if any of your programs are working with adults. And I don't know, David and Susan, if you want to say anything about what's going on in adult restorative justice, which of course is quite a different legal matter, but anything anyone wants to ask, first of all, or anything anyone wants to add.
Hi, my name is Kathy. I'm from
Hi,
the state of
Kathy.
Maryland. I currently
Welcome.
work with Maryland Department of Juvenile Services. And no,
Mhm.
they're not doing anything around restorative justice. But I retired in 2018 from the federal government in DC, and we ran balancing restorative justice. We had centers throughout the whole city for juveniles.
Oh,
We
great.
had one in each corridor of the city, and we ran circles where they would come in and we would mediate with our circle groups.
Mhm.
And I just found that with those balancing restorative justice centers, we were able to touch youth. We were able to get youth to open up. They were able to give back into the communities that they had hurt. We would look for them to do volunteer. We would partner with other agencies around the city, and it was really effective with keeping youth out of the front end of going deeper into the criminal delinquent justice system.
Fantastic. It sounds like some of what Susan was saying is needed, right? Trying to
Yeah.
kind of move upstream and catch the kids early.
Absolutely.
And we would even allow them to bring their siblings and families in when we would run these circles.
Great. And I'm seeing, is it Danny Torres? Were you looking to raise your hand?
Yes, I just wanted to say that we just launched the Neighborhood Courts program in Santa Cruz. I'm the Neighborhood Courts program coordinator from the Conflict Resolution Center. So it's been a pleasure to be in here. We've been working with adults. So we started with some cases already. We've been held in 8 conferences, and it has been completely based on restorative justice. We train 24 volunteers, and the base of this program, of course, is restorative justice. So has been working. We have already 2 people that were graduated after finalizing their agreements, and just that. I know you are tight in time, but I just wanted to share that.
No, I'm really glad you did. And I know there are a number of people here from Santa Cruz. So
yeah, I think we have one of our volunteers, and we have the program coordinator from the district attorney's office, and the restorative justice director from the Conflict Resolution Center too. But it has been very successful with the volunteers and with the participants. Have been really, really welcome the program, and they really appreciate that we have this opportunity. They feel comfortable and safe, and we're really worried about the COVID situation, and respecting all that, and trying to make it as kind and thoughtful possible.
So where do you get your referrals from? The court or probation or both? Probation.
Yeah.
I see a question.
On your launch. It's wonderful.
Yeah. Yeah, and we are working on training more the volunteers and seeing what are the needs. Every time we just launched the program, so we're seeing that we need to fix some stuff, but it has been wonderful, and a whole world to discover about restorative justice. So
Yeah. Greg, I see a question in the chat. Do you want to just say it out loud, or should we read it? I think you might still be muted. So if you can find that little microphone, or I'm not hearing you. I don't know if others are. Yeah, still not hearing you. Maybe you're just not turned up. That's possible. Anyway, while you're looking for that, in the chat, he's asked what percentage of youth have children, and what, if any, considerations must be in place when drafting an agreement. So two questions in one there, I think. Susan or David, any of the youth you've dealt with, are they parents on occasion?
Yes. Yep, we did have a few.
And was that any different than the other proceedings? And
We certainly need to make sure that the directives are achievable so that there's not an additional sense of failure on the part of the, offending parent.
Right.
We really have to make sure that the victim also, if there's a victim involved, understands the full consequences of it. So it doesn't look like an excuse, but it looks more like what needs to be achievable for the rights to be, addressed and harm to be corrected, will work for the benefit of the child as well. Because we don't want to create another situation where we have another neglected child because now the parent is, in a bind.
Right.
But
Right.
it's tricky, but it definitely, we bring a lot of people to the conversation on that one.
Great. And as to what considerations when writing up agreements, would either of you like to address that?
David?
I think one of the things Susan mentioned earlier was just that it needs to be doable. So there's a lot of questioning on behalf of the mediators to really check in with the parties, especially when you're dealing with someone who might be quite young. We had some fairly young offenders who, just because of the situation, are somewhat willing to agree to just about anything. And so you really have to check back with them as to what they're agreeing to, and also what type of support they might need in order to accomplish what they're agreeing to. If you had a youth who was going to, say, go over to somebody's house and repaint their fence, you needed to know it was safe for them to do that. You needed to know whether or not their parents were going to be supportive of them going over there because they're going to need a ride. And also what accommodations the person who owns the house is going to make in order for them to be able to come over there and do that. And so it's really a matter of being very clear on what the expectations of both parties are and what's doable on their behalf.
And I would just add to that we can get sidetracked by just the actions of what happened in a police report. What was the intention? Back to the golf cart, a joyride versus outright theft. So we really look hard at intention, and that's the beauty of all this work is storytelling. What is the story behind the offense?
Right. Well, thank you for sharing your stories today. I think we're going to wrap it up and conclude with a very big thanks to David and Susan, not just for speaking to us today, but for all the programming you've been giving to our communities and to all of you who are doing this work. It's so important. Please keep up the good work and stay in touch. And thank you, Maddie, for helping host. And I'll stay on for a few more minutes, but you're welcome to get on with your day. And one last round of applause. Yay, David and Susan. Thank you.